There we go.
Right, morning. Welcome everybody. So those of you who've just joined us, we're having a nice little chat, so you interrupted that. So yeah, it's really not good. You must stay away longer and come in later. No, just joking. Good to have you all on board this morning. Fantastic morning here again in Joburg. The sun is up, the clouds are sort of gone, I think. Yeah, there you go. So Trevor's showing us he's got a few clouds there, but you know, that's just the way Trevor is. He walks around with a few clouds around his head most of the time. So yeah, welcome. So we're talking ethics this morning. So what are ethics? And are there such things as situational ethics and situational morals? So sometimes I think certain leaders in the world definitely comply with situational ethics and situational morals. Hopefully we don't, but maybe we do. Lee, I don't know. Over to you.
Thanks, Ivan. Yeah, so I've got two slides and I've gone down, but if I show those slides, it's more about ethical leadership. And so we can bounce around that, whether we're talking about personal ethics or how that relates to ethical leadership. But I wanted just to give just a kind of a trampoline to discuss different kinds of ethics. And I just see that Trevor's put no two people's ethics are the same. And it's quite interesting because when I start my ethical leadership course, my first question is, well, whose ethics are we going to follow? And it's that recognition that in many cases, ethics is very personal, or at least relating to a group that you've imbibed certain ethical principles based on how you grew up. And there is an argument, though, that there are certain universal ethical principles that across cultures, across people, and they would be things as basic as you don't take other people's stuff and you don't murder. But of course, there's always going to be exceptions to those rules. So that then becomes Ivan's thing about situational ethics, because what about wars and all of those kinds of things? So we can go down that track. So we can have those discussions, but I wanted to just share these two, sorry, where am I? Let me start by sharing. These just two, they are, now you see, I'm doing the wrong thing. Sharing the wrong presentation. Okay, they're two models. So this first, I don't know if I've done the right thing. Can you see me? No. Too much going on. There we go. Eventually we get there. So in this model, in this model we have, this is Stephen Covey's model of principle-centered leadership. And I thought it was quite interesting because it uses Jasper's word, because he spoke about a moral compass. And this is worked on the compass model, and at any point in time, you may need to direct the compass of your leadership in one way or another. And that the one is security, which is a sense of your own worth, identity, emotional anchorage, self-esteem, and personal strength. Then guidance, which is your standards, principles, criteria, beliefs, and an internal monitor that serves as your conscience. And then there's power, which is not domination, but rather the capacity to act, the strength and courage to accomplish something, and the vital energy to make choices. And then wisdom, and I put wisdoms, which was just a slight typo there. It is supposed to say wisdom, a sense of balance with a keen understanding of how various parts apply and relate to each other. So it's all about holding things in balance and embracing judgment, discernment, and perspective. So those I thought just to give us some words and something to hold on to in terms of where do we start. And then this one is an African model of what Roel Khoza, who was the chairman of Nedbank, he uses this model in his book called Attuned Leadership, where these three intersecting circles are normative, in other words, value-driven, cognitive, which is striving for wholeness, and cognitive, which is perceptive and rational. And that the connections between them are that if you are value-driven and cognitive, you are, there's this meditative and self-attuned. The intellect and the cognitive makes for emotional intelligence, and the cognitive and the normative is both analytical and ethical. And that what holds it together in the center is having a grasp of the history, yearnings, and destiny of the fellowship. So that might be a mouthful to get started with, but I wanted just to have something concrete, really, that we could get going with. But really, so ethics, ethical leadership, what do you think?
Great, thanks, Lee. I don't know about concrete. I don't know if you build anything on all those words. You know, it's a bit difficult to create a foundation out of so many big words. So yeah, way beyond my pay grade, those big words, I'm sure. But so who do we start with this morning? I think we have to start with Mpumalelo this morning.
Yeah, good morning to everyone. Yeah, I so wanted to be part of yesterday's conversation because I was interested in the whole corruption thing. But yeah, they decided I don't need electricity yesterday morning, so I was without Wi-Fi and so forth. And even today's topic, I think, required that I spend an afternoon thinking about it. So trying to speak off at the cuff or just off like that, it's not that easy. So I'll probably not speak to what you said, Lee, and I'll just speak on what comes top of my mind or instantly. For me, I think ethical leadership or ethics become important in a sense that there should be enough commonalities between men to allow them to be able to live together and with as much fairness as possible. And so sometimes the question of whose ethics, what ethics, I think the challenge with those questions at times is that it forgoes the thought that even if I may think something is not an ethic, but because there is a need that human beings to a certain extent live in harmony with each other, you do need commonalities. I need to agree to an ethic, even if it may not necessarily be how I view life and how I see life. But being able to live with Ivan in harmony and me and him come into agreeing on something that will make the both of us function in a fair way should be a bigger question than whose ethics. And the last thing that I would say is that I think the question of ethics, the question of corruption or a man's heart are very difficult for me personally. It may be different for other people to discuss in the absence of having a God as a being or as an entity. And because for me, that's what centers what becomes ethics or what becomes morality. When you say to me, whose ethics? My instant answer always is God's ethics, God's intent of how men were supposed to live in a correct and in a right way. Those are probably my shallowest thoughts, given that I hadn't had the opportunity to think about this topic thoroughly. But for me, the conversation of corruption, the conversation of ethics are very difficult to have outside God, because for me, then what it means is that I, as Mpumi, have to be a God to myself and decide what is right and what is wrong. And I tend to think that has a level of selfishness that comes in as well. Whereas if my what is wrong and what is right is about what does God think, what was his intention, that informs then for me what is right and what is wrong. Let me leave it at that.
Sure, and for me, when your thoughts are shallow, they're deep beyond belief. So thanks for that. Some really good points there. Appreciate that. So right, Herman, let's get across to you next, seeing that you got your pen in the air.
Morning, everyone. Just a very brief response to Pumelelo. I don't believe, I'm a non-Christian, and yet I think I understand what ethics are. And I consider ethics a very important branch of philosophy. And for me, it should be actually a subject that should be taught at school. And we should really make an effort that ethics are understood on a much wider level. Otherwise, we end up with presidents who have to pay porn stars so that their names doesn't appear in the press and similar things. When I shared with you yesterday about what I did with regards to bribing, that obviously was anything but ethical. Yet at the same time, I think I had a very strong work ethics, because I fulfilled the mandate given by my employer. And I really was quite an enthusiastic, not necessarily on the bribing scene so much, but in general terms, quite an enthusiastic employee. So you could actually, within one person, have the two things, namely being unethical on the one hand and yet having and kind of have ethics on the other. I believe, Lee, going back to leadership, that ethics need to play a much greater role in leadership today than it ever has before. I mean, with all due respect, capitalism has enabled us to achieve a level of living which is unprecedented in man's history, but at the same time at a horrible cost. And I think it's now where ethical leadership needs to come in order to weigh up where growth is detrimental and where growth is beneficial. And I think that is possibly the biggest, A, it's a blind spot with a lot of leaders, and B, I think it's possibly one of the biggest leadership challenges we are facing. Thank you.
Thanks, Herman. Yeah, it does raise an interesting question. You know, who determines what is ethical and what is not ethical? You know, if you're going to put those kinds of ideas and processes into our learning systems and so on, you know, who's the arbiter? Who's the person who actually controls what is taught and how it's taught and where it's taught? You know, so yeah, I think it's a big problem. I think it's a big challenge to actually define those boundaries, and once again, you start doing that, you know, who defines them? So yeah, an interesting challenge, I think. Right, Cecile, let's get across to you next.
Sorry, can you just give me a sec? I'm on the line with my technician.
Okay. All right, no problem. Okay, so let's get across to Donovan.
Morning, everyone. Yeah, ethics is quite a touchy subject, and it's very subjective. You can't put a number or a figure or level to it. It's, you know, it's how people perceive it. Yeah, it's difficult for me to define because I'm in the construction industry. I know all about bricks and mortar and steel, something tangible, whereas ethics is not tangible at all. So yeah, as I was saying, it's very subjective. and it depends on who's involved and who's affected by it. Thank you.
Thanks, Donovan. Yeah, I think I can imagine the difficulty of building a decent building if the suppliers of the material weren't ethical. You know, things might just fall down around you. So, right, Trevor Carty, let's come across to you next.
Morning, everybody. The clouds have now gone. What defines ethics? I think it comes down to that activity that you're involved in at that given time. So if you're in an environment, let's call it a religious environment, you have a different set of ethics to when you're in a boardroom, to when you're on a golf course, to when you're in a pub, to when you're on a wisdom's chat. So I think it's the specified conduct and the moral correctness of that specified conduct in that given situation. So how are you behaving? What's your conduct life like in terms of the activity that you're undertaking at that given time? So there's my 2 cents worth for the morning.
Great, thanks, Trevor. Yeah, it's interesting. I suppose it depends on how you define that. Does it become situational ethics, or is it actually merely defined by the context, as you said? So an interesting point that. All right, Jasper, let's get across to you next.
Hi there. Yeah, I think to answer any of these kind of questions, you must first be clear in your mind what is the definition of it. So I know all of us are trying to define it so that we can then give a comment on it. So when I looked at the word, it says principles that govern behavior, which is fine. But now next step is then taught by whom? Because none of us get born with ethics. You get born with the DNA. So that principles that govern behavior were taught and assimilated during your growing up years and going from there. So if I grew up in a loving home that teaches me certain Christian values and stuff like that, I will certainly be totally different from someone who grew up and had to hit the ground running because he survives in a squatter camp, and every day it's a battle to say, well, I have food in my stomach. So for that person, taking food wherever he can get it and sometimes even steal it is probably okay. And that example that Trevor raised a couple of days ago with the lady who worked with them, that saw nothing wrong in it to say, or to make myself a sandwich for later in the evening and probably share it with people. And we've seen many such examples here in our guest house with people sweeping after an event and filling their bags for taking stuff home. But for them, it's okay. So if the key word then is principle that govern behavior, it depends on who teaches you the rules. But then the next question is, okay, so as we then start mixing, and that guy from the squatter camp start mixing with the guy from another background, that comes then back to one of the speakers who says, okay, how do we work together? So can ethics change and adapt with time? So it then almost become a social conduct where we ultimately say, all right, for us to engage successfully with one another, here's our shared culture. And it's a shared culture based on agreed societal behaviors. And it could be things like, how do you greet me? How do you, interpersonal space and all sorts of things like that. So I think it's a very fluid topic. And yes, I think I agree with Mpumelelo that when it comes to hard choices, it's safest and easiest to go back to a historical book that has stood the test of time, where a very clear guidelines were given rather than getting a person to play God in a situation. But then if you don't have it, then it's a fluid topic, and you must understand we are opening ourselves for what do you call it, for misunderstanding and talking past each other.
Right, thanks, Jasper. Yeah, it is. Question is whether ethics should be fluid or not. I don't know. You know, I think that's for me is a debate. Anyway, Caroline, welcome back. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, morning everyone. Sorry I haven't been taking part, but nice to see you all. I did watch the video last night because, yeah, corruption and ethics are quite, you know, important topics in the current climate. So I think, as far as ethics is concerned, yeah, just looking at Lee's comment there, do we intuitively know what is right and wrong? I think people do intuitively know what's right and wrong, and I think it gets lost. I think I read something sometime about fairness, that every child basically has basically knows what fairness is. They know if something is unfair. And people then get very, very upset if they feel that they're being treated unfairly. And okay, maybe fairness is just one part of ethics, but I think there are some universal principles, but I think that they have to some extent been lost, and maybe they get lost as you grow up and you have to fight for survival, or you have to make choices that are maybe not ethical, and then it's like your conscience. Your conscience guides you as to what is right. And I think most people have a conscience, even whether they're Christian or not. But if you suppress that conscience and you go a different path, the more you suppress it, I suppose, the less it starts telling you what to do, or you learn not to listen to it. So in a sense, we do have to try and go back to those innate and those core principles that maybe everybody or the greater part of society can actually agree on. And I do think the world is crying out for ethical leadership. And you can see that in movements, you know, in the climate movement, in all sorts of protests. It is people crying out for ethical leadership and an ethical way of doing things. And I do agree that it needs to be taught at school. I think that would be more than useful. And I also do think that you know, a lot of like corruption, the story that Lee told about the university in Mpumalanga, to stamp out that kind of corruption, you have to do it from the top. There's no other way. And you have to be prepared to go through a lot of hardship and a lot of to stand your ground. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. A friend of mine's got a daughter who's in matric and, you know, is needing to pass a driver's license. And at her school, which is a private, but one of the cheaper private schools, it is 100% known that the only way you get a driver's license is by paying a bribe. And the way you do it is you put 100 Rand, which is not a lot of money, inside your papers, and that goes in when you hand it in, not to the inspector. By the time the inspector comes out, he knows whether that money's been paid or not. So anyway, you know, so this daughter did her first test, didn't pass, went on to do a second test, and then she actually did pass. But everybody at the school thought she was completely mad not to pay a bribe. And her mother was basically prepared to pay it come the third time if she hadn't passed the second time, because it costs more money. You know, it costs 1,700 Rand to re-get the driving school and the car and all that stuff. So it's much cheaper to pay 100 Rand. And that's not going to stop because everybody in the system is used to it. The only way to stop it is from the top. Yeah, okay, that's my 2 cents worth.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Yeah, it's interesting. You know, people get pushed to the point of taking those decisions because, as you say, you know, there's the risk reward and benefit sum starts to skew them to the side of unethical behavior. It's a real challenge. All right, Trevor, now let's come to you next.
So clearly ethics are flexible. Whatever the given situation, the ethics or value system that you have, you will try and work around your value system as best as you can. But I think Trevor Carty almost brought it up. I don't know that I agree with the manner in which he brought it up, but that's an argument I will have with him at other stages. But I certainly do think that we have personal values, and you can see these personal values come out in times of crisis. And that's when you can, they talk of the measure of an individual. Look at how they behave in times of crisis or when the chips are down in a big way. And then you'll get a measure of how people operate. I was just thinking, what my top value has always been throughout my life to be absolutely honest as best as I can, because maybe a situation doesn't allow for it, but 99.99%. I will be brutally honest in my interaction with an individual if I believe what they are doing does not comply with my value system, and I will express that to them. And if they're either working for me, and this is what happened in the past, I'd have the discussion once. If they do that again, I'd have the discussion a second time. If it happens the third time, we split company. And that perhaps boils down to a comment I think I made on this forum the other day. If someone stabs me in the back, that is almost an unbreakable no for me. I cut straight away. So those ethics. Oh, by the way, I also wanted to mention, I watch what King 1, King 2, King 3, King 4, it's probably at King 155, I gave up because the more that he started talking about and lecturing the whole country on ethics, the worse we got, the bigger the corruption. The leaders of listed companies just started going off the rails, and you can see what happened in these various companies over the last 2-3 years. And so I think people were following the type of ethics that people were applying from top down in a country, political leaders, company leaders, corporate leaders. So there are too few people that have the type of ethics that I subscribe to. Okay, I better stop ranting.
Thanks, Trevor. Yeah. Right, Cecile, let's get across to you next. Still busy. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll come back to you. So Ed, I'm going to get across to you then.
Yeah, I think I'm in real trouble this morning because I think Lee's in charge of the controls. I'm going to disagree with Trevor. I'm going to annoy Lee. I'm going to question Jasper. I'm really going to upset everyone, I hope. Lee, the power of Lee is amazing. You all know I'm into running. There's one brand that I really dislike, and that's Nike. Now, I think they're great after listening to Lee, because she talked about and she had a presentation around principle-centered leadership, Venn diagrams, attenuated leadership, normative, cognitive, and something else. And I thought, what a load of, why not just do it? Just do the right thing. Take that Nike slogan and just do it. And I think it is about having a set of principles that govern a person's behavior. And then you just apply those principles all the time. And it's not situational. Those principles are your principles and you apply them all the time. They might manifest themselves in a different way in a certain situation. And it has nothing to do with right or wrong. I had a friend when I was growing up. I'm not quite sure how we became friends. He was the gang leader in a very tough estate near where I lived. And for some reason, he liked me. And his ethics were quite simple. He looked after his friends. And one time I needed to get home and someone had stolen my bike. So he said, I'll nick a car for you, Edward. And then my girlfriend went off with another bloke and he threatened to knife him. That was his principles and he stuck to them all the time throughout. And I think it is, ethics is sticking to your principles. Whether those principles are right, wrong, or indifferent is a different argument. And Jasper said, let's go back to the book. Well, which book? Is it the Quran? Is it the New Testament? Is it the Old Testament? I think it is just sticking to those principles. And interesting enough, I'm involved with the University of Exeter through a health and environment public engagement group. And one of our groups sits on their ethics committee. And the ethics committee is designed to make sure that all the research they do sticks to their principles they've laid out. And the ethics committee makes sure it agrees with those pre-agreed rules. So I think ethics is about sticking to your rules. If you're a vegan, you don't suddenly have a pork chop because you like pork. You stick to being a vegan. And for me, it's that simple. Stick to what is your founding principle. So I hope that makes a bit of sense. And I think discussion about right and wrong is a different discussion.
Great stuff. Thanks, Ed. Yeah, I think some great points there. Right, Steve, I think it's over to you to show us the way.
Oh, Lord, help us all. Jeepers. I think I'll start by agreeing and disagreeing with Ed to get going. So ethics, like if you look at the etymology of the word ethics, it comes from the Greek ethos, which means character, right? And so you've got to go back to have a look at kind of some of the origins of some of this stuff to understand it. So we need to distinguish between ethics and morals. Morals talks about the customs, current customs. Essentially, if we're looking at an individual person, you can talk about their behavior. Ethics is the foundational principles underlying that. It's what we investigate and that then what manifests in our decisions and our behavior. So I would agree with Ed that if you're going to have principles, you need to stick with them. I think one of the principles that governs the idea of character is that character is not for sale. If it is, then it's not character. If it's flexible from situation to situation, person to person, that's not character. That is malleable morals from context to context. However, character does change and mature over time. And so to just pick one set of principles and say we're going to rigidly stick with them, from over time, and either as an individual, as a society, etc., that's not really how life works, I don't think. Somebody talked about fairness earlier, and I was going to make that comment. So C.S. Lewis, in one of his writings, which I found really interesting, so he uses it as a religious argument, but I'm just going to translocate it into the philosophy side of ethics. He says that everybody has this idea of fairness, this right from wrong. And he asks the question, where does that come from? All right. But he's not saying that everybody has the same idea of right from wrong. It's just within us, we have this search for fair. I don't like this. I do like that. I don't like it when you do that to me. And I think that for me is an idea behind ethics. And ethics is not a static point. I think we're on a trajectory as people and as a society. And so ethics for me is the curiosity of exploring right from wrong and looking into the foundational principles that can govern us as people and us as society. And it's exploratory. And if you look at a lot of the debates happening around the world at the moment, you look at Black Lives Matter, you look at the anti-abortion versus abortion people in the US that are ready to string each other up. And they're all accessing their own, you know, as Herman says, and other people said, and Ed just said, they access their own books and their own history and their own, you know, ways of thinking to try and make judgments on right and wrong. But that's what it needs to be. We need to be curious, and we need to dig into the ideas of what makes character, what makes right from wrong, so that we can come to better and better expressions of morals in every age of human development, in every season of our own lives, etc. And so that's ethics is something that's really close to my heart. And so once you are curious and once you're discovering things, when you come to a new position, I think you have to stick with it. That's what character is for me. And that's where your ethics starts to govern your morals. But things they are flexible. You know, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, the idea of all life being sacred, or, you know, the universal rights of human beings, that wasn't even a thing. You know, that has come about over time, and different people have propositioned that from different perspectives. And so different paradigms, different cultures have different ways of looking at right and wrong. And for me, it's digging into the exploration of that that makes sense over the long term. In the medium, we have to find, I like what Mpumelelo says, we have to find ways of living together. And so I think we have to investigate ethics together so that we can come up with our current expression of morals in ways in which we can live together more helpfully. But past expressions of ethics have been how we can murder each other better. And that's been morals of certain societies over others. But it's far too complex to do justice to in a short discussion. But that's maybe what one last thing. This is what I wanted to share with you. I wanted to comment on, I think Herman said it first about teaching ethics in schools. I'm investigating this book at the moment. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Justice. It's by a Harvard professor, and it's essentially his first year lectures on ethics. And I'm looking into it as a course to do with grades 10s, 11s, and 12s in high school context. Not from a, you know, as Ivan said, who figures out the boundaries, like what do we teach? What's wonderful about this is that he covers a huge array of different philosophical thinkers and different takes on ethics, and asking the question of justice, what is right from wrong. And I do think we need to be teaching young people critical thinking skills, not this is right and this is wrong, because that's stasis thinking. That puts you in a static place. We need to introduce them to trajectory thinking and process, and ask them the question, if they were to dig into ethics, if they were to become ethical human beings, and they were to dig into this idea, what would they discover in their season in life, and what would the future of our world look like if they were to start to figure out what the morals of that season would be. So I don't know, maybe I can share the author and thing on the chat if you want to see it, but it's been a fascinating read for me that hopefully you'll find interesting. Anyway, that's a long way of giving you some of my thoughts. Anyway.
Great, thanks, Steve. So in this season, I'm ethically and morally completely confounded because we've gotten around.
What a great place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so, you know, there are a couple of questions, and for me, I think it comes down to simplify things. You know, you've really got to simplify things, because I think what happens with these discussions and processes that are happening in society at large is you start perverting the whole scale. You know, do the rights of the perpetrator become more important than those of the victim? And I think I think we're definitely seeing that in certain societies at this time. And for me, that's a real challenge from an ethical perspective, is when somebody who's actually committed an offense against another individual seems to be getting better protection, better rights, and better support than the person who's actually been wronged in the situation. So for me, that is a serious problem. But having said that, I really do think we need to simplify this, you know, and I have to agree with Ed largely, and it comes down to, you know, what are your values, what are your principles, what are your ethics, and do you stick to them? Well, firstly, do you really know what they are? Have you examined them? And do you actually, believe in what you've examined there? I think too many people never go to that level of actually examining their own values and defining them, and then saying, well, are these things I'm prepared to live or die by? Because that's what true values are. If you're not prepared to live and die by them, they're not values. And if they're not values, then the whole system falls apart. So for me, that's I think the real challenge is actually getting people to examine those things and say, that is something I will not do. That's a boundary I will not cross, or that's something I will definitely do. And if you can get to that level of understanding across the spectrum, I think you have a very different world on your hands. And sometimes it's just as simple as asking the question is, how would I feel if somebody did that to me? And if that's the way I feel, should I do it to them? And that's it. You ask those two questions in any given situation and decide your answer. So yeah, that's my 2 cents worth, as we say in the classics. So Lee, I think that's over to you to wrap up and tell us whether we've passed the test.
Oh, what great discussions. Thanks, everybody, bringing great minds together. And I love the fact that we end up with more questions than answers, but it certainly does kind of stimulate the thinking. I think I actually was debating whether to start with this today or not. And so maybe it's the question that I'd like to raise for us tomorrow. And that is how Ivan ended. And that is, how do we stick to our principles? And, Edward says, just do it. And I know people who do that. But I also realize that for many people, and I look, many famous people that we know well, they start out with good intentions. And I think even of the people who are defending their principles, like abortion or anti-abortion or whatever the case may be, but they do it in unethical ways, or what I would say are unethical ways. And I just want to read, this is in fact, I won't. I'll start it tomorrow because we're running out of time. But let's ask that question. How do we stick to our own ethics? And however you want to take that. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Great. Thanks, Lee. Thanks, everyone. Have a fantastic day further. Try and be ethical. And we'll see you in the morning, depending on the situation. All right. Have a good one. Cheers.